بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We start today our second session in our reading of Al-Imam al-Dabusi's Taqwim al-adilla, and in this first section after his introduction he will be clarifying the names of particular types of proof in the sacred law and giving some linguistic and technical insights into each of these terms. So he says in his chapter, Al-Qawl fi Asma Anwa' al-hujaj, the various names given to the proofs. And he said right at the end of the introduction that his goal in this book was to bring about in every human being the latent ability for a penetrating insight into the meanings of sacred injunctions, how to tie that to the sacred texts. He said the means to awaken this ability is by showing to people the proofs of the sacred law. So then he starts the book by the names of the proofs before then going into each of them one by one. So he says these proofs that we have been tasked to assess, to study, so that we can know what Allah Most High has legislated for us of the various sacred injunctions, and that we have been similarly tasked not to know the injunctions through them, but then tasked to practice them, because they are cases, that they establish a case against us, as he will be saying today. And these various proofs have been given a number of names so that they can be differentiated, some from the others, based on the terms of the experts of law, the fuqaha. And there are four basic names that he wants to categorize all the proofs under: ayah, dalil, illah, and hal. So we'll go through each of these with some linguistic insights, and I've omitted just a few of the linguistic terms he gives for the ayah and for the dalil, and some technical insights of how these linguistic meanings give rise to why these are proofs. And he gives quite a few technical insights into the illah, and I've included all of them in what will follow, because I think they were a bit difficult and challenging, and so maybe it'll be good to discuss them here together. So first of all, the global term he's using, which I'm calling here proof, is the hujja. So he says the word hujja covers everything that I'm going to be saying in this section, and it is synonymous to another word, bayyina, and also to the word burhan. So what does hujja mean? He says it comes from the Arabic term hajja, the verb, which means to overcome somebody. So you could say in a sentence, hajajtuhu fahajajtuhu. I applied a proof against him, and therefore I overcame him. Meaning, I overcame him, and therefore I forced my proof against him, and he became overcome. So why is a hujja termed hujja? Because the right of Allah is, if you like, forced on us by this proof. It makes a case against us. We are obliged to do something because of it. It makes us overcome, if you like, if you were to picture a sort of debate with Allah, I didn't do it. Allah says, why didn't you do it? I said, well, I didn't know. And this, he says, yeah, but the hujjah came to you. So this hujjah is something which is a case against us before God, and we have no more excuse after it. So that's why it's an obligating case. It overcomes us morally in the next life, and therefore it should overcome us morally in this life, overcome our conscience. He then says another possible, you could say, complementary origin for the word. You could also say these proofs are called hujjah because another meaning of the term is ruju'. And that's one of the origins, he says, of the word hajj. When we do hajj to the house, we are returning to the house. And that's why he says the house in the Quran was called mathaba linnas. It's a place of return, as if it's a sort of origin for all of us. It's a home for all of us, and we return back to it on the hajj. And so the proof is called a hujjah because we are obligated to return back to it. It's like a reference point we must turn back to in terms of our practical considerations, moral acts. And then he says this global category, the obligating proof, it incorporates within it proofs which give us absolute certitude. There's no doubt that God wants us to do something. And there could be something that doesn't give absolute certitude, but sort of a probable knowledge. It seems most likely that Allah wants something from us. Each of these are proofs. Each of these are morally obligating. In this life, they should overcome conscience. And in the next life, they will overcome us in a sort of, in the back and forth that will happen in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he said, I will explain further in later chapters why we are obligated to put into practice, to practice both of these sorts of knowledge, the knowledge of certitude and the knowledge of probability. He does not go into that in this current section. And lastly, the synonymous term bayyina, which comes from bayan, which means clarification. So bayyana means that which is very clear, which makes something distinct from everything else. It's because these proofs, we are obliged to practice them once it becomes clear to the heart why these are obligating. So these will clarify. The proof is not, it's something whose its obligating nature becomes clear once you see it, once the heart observes it. We spoke about the heart in the introduction, and he'll speak about it again later today. And he simply says about burhan, it's another word for hujja linguistically. So that's the overarching term, the hujja, and why it's used and what it signifies in this life and in the next life. So the first term of the hujjaj, the first type of hujja is what he calls the ayah, which you could simply say from his explanation, it's the clear sign. So he says the ayah is a noun when used by itself for a proof that leads to certain knowledge. So ayah is the word we will use for proofs which give you absolute certainty that Allah really wants this from you. And that's why he says the miracles of prophets in the Quran are called their ayat, because they are clear signs which give certain knowledge, because the miracle gives certain knowledge. And linguistically it means a sign, which is an alama. He then raises a question. You might ask, but there are some people who don't know about the prophethood of a prophet. They were not certain of it, even after these clear signs came. So how can you say an ayah is that which gives certain knowledge? He says, we reply to this objection by saying, these hujjaj of which we speak about right now, they do not give certain knowledge out of compulsion, like it doesn't force itself on you. Rather, there has to be reflection. And he'll speak about reflection in a little bit again. You must reflect on them in order for it to obligate or to cause its knowledge in you. And those who were ignorant about the prophets after the signs of the prophets were ignorant because they didn't reflect. They chose not to reflect. But this is not an excuse to choose not to reflect. Because the aql, again, of which he spoke about last time, is a faculty within us that compels us to reflect. And so we have no excuse to say we did not apply our faculty, which was given to us for this exact purpose. And then he furthermore says, if these proofs of which we speak force themselves upon people, force their knowledge upon people, then there would be no virtue in pursuing the hujjaj. There would be no reward and punishment because the knowledge becomes obvious. And the whole point of his introduction was that people have to strive to be the best and most perfect form of human. And that striving is by applying their faculties that God has given them. Specifically, he spoke about the spirit and he spoke about the intellect. And so there's virtue and there's a duty to pursue the hujjaj, and they are clear, but they require the application of these faculties, the faculty specifically here of the intellect. The next one, he says the dalil, which you could roughly call the articulate guide, literally, which is how he will explain the term. He says the second type of hujjah or proof is the dalil, which is a name given to a proof which is articulated, i.e. there's some speech in it. Because linguistically, the word dalil actually means dal, the one who does something. And so it means the one who gives guidance, like the word dal. So dalil actually means guide, a person who guides you to something. And people guide through speech. And therefore it's an articulate act of guidance. And then it was used to refer to the speech of such a person. So dalil really means a guiding person, and then was used to mean the words this person guides with. You might object to this basis for the word dalil, because we all find it acceptable to say that smoke is the dalil of the fire. Smoke guides you to the presence of fire. A building guides you to the presence of a builder. But there is no speech in these acts. We say, he responds, this is figurative usage, because it's as if these things are speaking to you, because they are conveying information. Just like Allah Most High says about a wall that was about to fall over in Surah Al-Kahf, a wall which wanted to fall over and then he fixed it. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala similarly said about the heavens and the earth, they said, we come in obedience to you. So the Quran ascribes speech to inanimate objects because their state is conveying a meaning which is normally conveyed by speech. So it's figurative to say a fire is the dalil, so smoke is the dalil for a fire. And then he says the dalil, whether it's applied figuratively in such a way to non-articulate dalil, or in reality to words, to spoken words, the dalil in either case is used for something which clarifies something hidden. So there's a matter that's unclear to you, and the dalil is coming to inform you. It's an informing proof. And he says all of these proofs that we're looking at are names. Some of them clarify what you might not be aware of, and some of them actually obligate. They bring an obligation about, which is the next one we're going to look at. And so the dalil is a specific kind of proof for the one that clarifies. The dalil tells you, it informs you of a sacred ruling or injunction. It doesn't bring it about. What does he mean by bringing something about? He means this next dalil, this next hujja, which is called the illah, the cause. And he has most to say about this one. He says, as for the illah, and he ties it very nicely to its real linguistic meaning. He says its linguistic meaning is that it's a name for a hal, and he means here with a shadda, a thing which dwells in something else. It's a thing which dwells in something else, which by virtue of its indwelling in something, the status of the resident in which it's dwelling changes. So it dwells in something and then changes the status of that thing. Or you could say it in another way, he says the same thing. It's that which brings about a matter in something by virtue of its dwelling in that thing, without any choice exercised. That's why it's simply a cause, it brings something about. For example, sickness in Arabic is called illah because the status or the state of that human being changes when the sickness dwells in him and he has no choice in it whatsoever. It's simply a cause, it brings things about. Similarly, we say that a wound is an illah for death, it's a cause for death, when it causes that blood flow which leads to death for the same definition, for the same reason. And that's why we will not say that the wounder, the one who stabbed you, who stabbed this person, is the cause of death. The wounder is not the illah of death because he chose, number one, and because he doesn't dwell in the person in whom death happened. So he really wants to hit this home, and he'll say this a few times. The illah exercised, there's no choice exercised, and it's a part of the thing in which that change occurs. And that's why a bit of theology comes in this section as well. We do not cause the pre-eternal, we do not call God mighty is he, exalted is his mention. We do not call him the cause of the universe. He's not the cause. He's not the illah of creation, because he brought about creation by choice, and because he does not dwell in creation. So it's incorrect, and you cannot call him the illah. He's not the cause. He's the creator. And so now you've understood the angle with which we use the word illah. You know that it's a different type. It's not an ayah, and it's not a dalil, because the ayah and the dalil obligate a matter. They'll tell you something, but they don't dwell in it. The miracle doesn't, depending on the miracle, might not dwell in the prophet. In the example he gave previously, it might dwell in the snake, in the stick that becomes a snake, for example. And the smoke isn't a part of the fire in the example he gave earlier. So the illah is a part of something, it's in it, it's an inherent quality. So now we come to the sacred usage. So in the sacred use of this term in sacred law, what we mean by the word illah are meanings, ideas, you can say abstract qualities, which are derived, i.e., through some reflection, from sacred texts. And these abstract qualities are the qualities to which sacred injunctions are tied in these texts. And because these qualities can extend to other areas outside of what the text spoke of, then the ruling of that text also extends to other subsidiary rulings. And he gives one example we can look at to explain what we're saying. Because these abstract qualities or these meanings, because they dwell in the case that the text spoke about explicitly, they changed it. They changed this ruling, not through any choice of the item of that ruling, from specificity to generality. What does he mean? Let's look at this example. So the Prophet ﷺ said, speaking about riba or usury, that if somebody is exchanging wheat for wheat, then they must exchange like for like, i.e., a similar amount with a similar amount, and any extra is going to be considered usury. So here you have a sacred text. This sacred text is telling you about usury, that wheat has a particular quality, which it doesn't state explicitly, by virtue of which you must exchange like for like only. Anything else would be a case of usury. So this text does not dwell in the wheat. This text is not a cause that brings about the ruling in the wheat. But upon reflection, if we were to say, and this is according to the Hanafi scholars, the illah for why wheat is an item of that has to be considered an item of usury, you must change it like for like, is because it's something which is sold in volume or mat'um is an illah that other scholars used. So if it's if we were to say it's because it's sold in volume, which is what Hanafi scholars say, or if we say because it's a food item, which is the illah according to other scholars, these are meanings which are inherent in the wheat. The wheat has these qualities. And if we were to say through inference that these qualities are why the wheat is a usurious item, then these qualities have now transformed this text and transformed the ruling from being simply about wheat to now being about all food items or all measurable items. So that's the change. That's why I said the illah brings about a change. That's why this thing is called an illah. It changes texts and rulings from specificity to generality. Because once you can tie the ruling to a cause, that cause will now be found in other items beyond the one stated in the text. These ilal, he says, could be called measurements because they are extracted carefully through careful consideration and measurement, i.e., by comparison. And so it's named after its cause. And similarly, they could be called nazar or consideration, careful consideration, because of the same idea. So what's the consequence then of knowing this about the illah? What does the illah give us in this chart he's drawing out of proofs of sacred law? The illah gives us knowledge but it's not certain knowledge because it requires extraction. It requires human reflection, which is fallible. It might be right and it might not be right. So it gives us knowledge, but not certitude. When does it give us a probable knowledge? When we use it, as we normally do, when we use these illas to mean those which are extracted through extreme effort, human effort, and careful consideration. Like we saw in the last example, some said wheat has usury because it's a food item, some said it's because it's sold in volume. So these efforts, human efforts, to arrive at these causes give us a probable knowledge of what God wants from us. Occasionally, the illah can give us certain knowledge. That's where the illah is arrived at through a certain method, which basically it means it's explicitly stated in the sacred text itself what the cause of a ruling is. Now he speaks about contrasting the words dalil and illah. And when we come to the end of this presentation, we'll review again the four terms and just get an overview of what he's been conveying in this section. So he says, if you contrast the terms illah and dalil, he said it's possible to call these sacred causes within sacred law, we could call them dalils as well, because these abstract qualities, these illas, these abstract causes, which are inherent in these items and rulings, have indicated to us, have guided us to know the ruling of God concerning subsidiary matters. So they are dalils, they indicate to us the ruling of Allah. And then he steps back and says, and he'll come back to this point, actually, all the illas of sacred law, as opposed to illas of science or illas of other investigations, are really markers and signs in reality about sacred injunctions, because they don't really bring about obligation, because the real obligator is, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is one who obligates rulings, not these causes. And he'll come back to why this point is important. And he says, but on the other hand, although you can call the illas dalils from this angle, they're not really bringing about a ruling, they're informing you of God's ruling. But you can't do it the other way around, really. You can't really call dalils illas, because the illah still has a meaning of obligation. It brings about something. But the dalil hasn't got that meaning at all. For example, you can call smoke the guide or the indicator that there's a fire, but you can never call it the cause of a fire, because that simply is not true. However, he just points out, every dalil is a cause with respect to your knowledge, because it causes knowledge in you. So for example, when I see the smoke does not bring about the fire, but it does bring about knowledge within me. So from this angle, a dalil is an illah for knowledge, but it's not an illah for the thing which it is indicating. The last of these hujaj, and then he'll step back and give some general reflections. The last of them he calls the hal, simply the presumed state. This is a reference what we would often call dalil istishab. We assume things to be as they are. So he says this means a ruling, a judgment, which has been established through some indicator, through some guide, but that indicator didn't really address whether this ruling will persist, nor did it address whether this ruling would stop persisting. And so this ruling is possible. It might not persist with its through its indicator, but we aren't sure. And therefore, something which has been established will be presumed to remain until we have an indication that it is no longer established. And we'll explain this later in the book. Just a very simple example. It's not a very important or a central hujja in the book, nor is it central in his discussion in this chapter, but just a simple example of what he refers to as something like, if there's a body of water which is to be pure, you will always assume it to be pure until you have reason to believe otherwise. So this idea that things are assumed to be as we know them to be until we know otherwise, they are also forms of hujjah. We are obliged to do something with that knowledge. But as you can see, it's the weakest of these forms of hujjah that he's explaining to us in this section. So he speaks the least of this. So now he steps back and he says, how do we approach each of these types of hujjah or proof? He goes, now, each of these types that we've mentioned of these proofs can be considered of two types, evident and subtle. The evident is something which is understood immediately. The moment you direct your mind to it, you immediately can discern what it is proving to you. The subtle is something which is not immediately comprehended except through some sort of reflection. You have to think about it. For example, he says, the staff of Moses, alayhi salam, was an evident sign because it swallowed up the staffs of the sorcerers of Pharaoh, and so the sorcerers immediately knew it as a sign, as a clear sign, without further reflection. It was immediate knowledge to their intellects. Similarly, splitting the sea, which he did, Moses alayhi salam, and similarly bringing forth water from a rock, which he also did alayhi salatu wasalam. The Quran, he says, to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is a subtle sign, meaning it is not known as a miracle except after reflection and consideration and comparing it with all the other types of human speech. Then he says the important point here, why he's saying all of this. Being evident does not give a proof greater weight purely from the fact that it was evident. And being more subtle, more hidden, more requiring of reflection, does not give anything less weight just because it was more subtle. Rather, what makes something weighty as a hujjah, its effect on its content. And he gives an example to show this. He says, well, haven't you seen that Allah made this world and he made it evident? And he made the next world and he made it hidden. But this world is not given any importance merely from the fact that it's evident, nor has the hiddenness of the next life given it any weakness. Rather, which is the predominant and the stronger and the weightier and the more significant of the two? It's the one whose effect is more. And what's the effect that's most significant here? Which one lasts longer? Which one is more permanent? Which one is more real, therefore? That's the one that is weightier, not the one that was evident and the one that was hidden. Similarly, he says, and he has a few comparisons, he says, the head is evident, the heart is hidden. Each has a sort of perception, but which is greater and weightier? He says it's the heart, because the perception which is ascribed to the heart is a perception which considers consequence. It's not mere calculation, which is what he ascribes to the brain, but it's a perception of what's most important. The heart can figure that out in this distinction between heart perception and mind perception. So being hidden isn't weak, being evident isn't strong. It's which thing has a greater effect. So he says the sacred text is a proof which is evident from the Prophet ﷺ, and the illah, the cause, is a hidden proof because it's only arrived at through careful reflection on this text. And then likewise, he says, there's more examples really. The light of the sun is evident, the light of the intellect is hidden. And the light of the intellect has, well, you could say a much greater effect in as much as in this, what we could call the scheme of the moral life, the food is an evident cause for immediate wellness in your body. Medicine is a hidden cause for wellness in the future. It doesn't give you an immediate effect, especially the herbal medicines they dealt with. You have to take it for a while, and it gives you wellness in the future. And food, obviously, you immediately feel it, but they're both important here, he's saying. Similarly, he says the causes of sacred law, some are more evident, these illas. And so our scholars, and he'll come back to this later in his book, say that if you're looking at a sacred injunction and there's a possible illah or a cause which is more obvious to the mind, they call this one the qiyas. And if there's another one that's also possible to be inferred as a cause for a ruling, but it's more subtle, it takes more reflection, they'll call the more subtle one istihsan. But then sometimes they'll give preference to the evident cause, sometimes they'll give precedence to the hidden cause. And so he's saying by all of this, what should be given precedence, it is the meaning, the strength of what it signifies, not the fact that it took reflection or didn't take reflection. And we'll come back again why he spent so much effort to explain this. So he says, similarly, again to continue, a dalil might give you evident indication, like smoke on a fire, and it could give you subtle indication, like the star guiding you to your road as you're traveling, because you can't really use that except with reflection and consideration. So once you've understood everything, that some of these need reflection, some of them don't, and it's not that the one that doesn't need reflection is in and of itself stronger. He says, now when you've considered that you have to bring effort to the table, he says, now let's look back. If you think about the ayah, which he said is the clear sign which gives certain knowledge, the ayah is something which gives you certain knowledge when the heart perceives it, when the heart looks at it, and gives you a knowledge. He says ala ittirar, meaning it forces knowledge upon you because it's certain. You can't deny what it's teaching you. But it only does that if you direct the heart to it. If you don't direct the heart to it, then that's against you. It's not because the sign wasn't clear. Just like so it's just like seeing a person with your eye without any veil. You have to look. You have to open your eyes. You have to remove the veil. And then you will definitely observe a person. You can't deny that knowledge. It's ilm ala ittirar. It forces itself upon you. So it says the ayah is a sign, regardless whether a person looks at it and observes it, perceives it, or doesn't look at it and falls short. That's against him. So now he's tying it back to the introduction we saw last time, i.e., the heart and the hawa. We said there's a battle between your heart, which is what you are obliged to use. The heart is the ability within you where he said last time it's the place where fiqh occurs, or penetrating insight. And the hawa, which we said last time was the lust, the caprice, which is trying to just pull you off at every turn to follow a low course. These two faculties within you now will be battling it out, and these hujaj are the thing which will make the case against you. The hujaj are the things which will guide your intellect to overcome lust. And they are clear once the heart turns to them, and you are obliged to turn your heart towards them. So that's how this whole section ties to the last section, which we took last time. So he says, the definition of a hujja then, what's a hujja? A hujja is that thing which overcomes lust. Because the heart, this thing within you, this faculty of reasoning, which can comprehend outcomes, this heart, a part of it looks through the compulse of lust. I want something. And a part of it looks from the point of view of intellect. This is the right thing to do. So the heart is between the two, between being pushed in one direction through lust and another direction through intellect. And so what happens is when the proof is established, then the intellect is given a clear anchor to direct the heart over the hawa, which has no clear anchor. And this process of the hujja, which encompasses everything we have looked at today, this hujja will give always strength to intellect in guiding the heart, whether the heart is compelled to certain knowledge because there are no doubts anymore, i.e., in the case of the ayah, or whether it's not compelled, i.e., it's probable knowledge. Either way, the intellect will be shown that this course of action must be followed, either because it's highly probable or because it's certain. And the heart's job is simply to direct itself honestly towards the hujja, and that's all it has to do, because then the intellect will comprehend and will force the heart. If the heart doesn't direct itself, that's when lust is going to take over. That's why the hujaj are the most important things for human perfection and rectification. And so he says the hujja will overcome a person's heart when he reflects. Um, yeah, and if the person is lazy and doesn't reflect, and that's the case is still against him because he had to use these faculties. So now you've understood what we're talking about now, the need for the human being to apply himself. You now know what is the dalil. The dalil is that thing which gives guidance, whereby if a person considers it, not which kind of person, dhu basira, and this is important, and we'll summarize this right at the end, namely that the ayah is clear to everyone. It just needs the heart to be directed because it gives certain knowledge. But the dalil and the illah, they require skill because they are sometimes subtle, sometimes they require extraction and consideration. And so a person has to be a person of insight. So a person of insight, if he reflects on this dalil, then it will guide him. It might not guide without reflection, and it might not guide someone who is not trained and nurtured, which is the purpose of this book, which we're looking at. So if a person with insight reflects on a dalil, he is guided. And it is a dalil, whether you reflect or not. The case is still against you. Why didn't you acquire insight? Why didn't you reflect? Why didn't you tread a path? So he's showing you that this whole purpose of this book is a path you have to follow for your perfection. And so the dalil gives knowledge, which is certain, or maybe a bit less than that in its limit or in its definition. And now we can say, what's the meaning or the definition then of the illah? The illah is that which brings about, you could almost say, brings into existence a particular ruling without any choice, to the extent in which it dwells in something, that thing being the site of a particular sacred injunction, the site being wheat, for example, in the example we took earlier. Now he's going to come back to some theological considerations which he deems very important, which is what he hinted at earlier. He says, but you must realize, when we use the word illah or cause in sacred law, we mean that through which the obligating of rulings are tied to its existing or dwelling in those items only with respect to us. The illah is a cause of a ruling with respect to us. It doesn't actually bring about a ruling in and of itself. It's not really a cause of obligation. So the causes of sacred law become causes because the sacred law made it a cause for us, not because in and of itself it is a cause. And so these through themselves are merely signs because they don't really bring about obligation. What he's trying to get at here, and he'll be explicit, is just an argument against some theologians who would argue that these illahs are real, and therefore the law, the sacred law, is a law whether God wanted it as such or not, meaning things bring about obligations. And so he's rejecting any such understanding at all. Things do not bring about law. God Ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the obligator of law, but He's tied the law to these causes. And so these causes indicate to us His law. They're not really causes when used in sacred terminology. So he says, we have called these meanings that we extract carefully from sacred texts, we call them causes only figuratively, because the obligation of rulings is connected to these with respect to us in terms of our responsibility in sacred law, not with respect to Allah. Nothing forces on Allah a law. These exist, ay halla, within the sights of these injunctions, and there is no obligation with respect to us before the sacred law. So he's saying there's no intrinsic natural law that these illal are obligating. There is no law until Allah orders us, i.e., with revelation. And when He orders us, He ties them to these causes, and then the causes have an effect. So he says, neither do they obligate before the sacred law, but then he also says, nor does the sacred law obligate without these ilal, i.e., in cases where the law is tied to these ilal. So now he's going to give an example of what he's talking about, this theological point that Allah obligates the law. So with respect to Allah, the illah is not an obligator. The illah is just a sign of His intent, of His instruction. But with respect to us, after Allah has obligated, with respect to us, the illah becomes an obligator. And he gives an example from sacred law to indicate this point of this theological point that he wants to bring about. So he says, these causes are very similar then to a conditional divorce. When a man makes a conditional divorce with respect to how the woman views this condition. So what's the example? A man says to a woman, a husband says to a wife, in other words, if you do such and such, then you are divorced. So he says the illah is like that condition with respect to the woman. So what does he mean? He says this condition, if you do such and such, is a marker. It indicates that a divorce has happened with respect to the husband and with respect to the divorce itself, meaning there was no divorce until the husband uttered something. So he was the originator of that utterance, and this fact of divorce has indicate, or this fact of divorce tied to that condition indicates his act, the act of the husband. So in his example, and Allah is above all examples, in this example, the husband's utterance is like the lawgiver's utterance, and the woman is like us, the morally responsible, and the condition is like the illah. So that's the example he's giving. So he says this utterance obligates a divorce, obligates a divorce by virtue of the utterance of the man, but it acts as a cause with respect to the woman, meaning it doesn't actually, no divorce happens to the woman. The man has uttered something, nothing has happened to the woman because the cause hasn't arisen yet. And because it's a cause with respect to the woman and not with respect to the man, he says the divorce does not have any effect on her unless she is a sight uh, which is capable of receiving that condition, meaning he must utter it and she's in principle capable of being divorced, i.e., she's married to him, in other words, when he makes that utterance. So if he makes the utterance and she's a capable sight for the utterance, and the utterance is real, but it's tied to a condition with respect to her, that condition is a cause, it will not bring anything about. The divorce will not happen until the cause happens. So the cause with respect to her is what brings about the divorce. But with respect to the man, the cause is not the cause of the divorce wasn't the event, the condition, it was his utterance. That's why he says it's not an illah for the man. So he says that's why the divorce will happen even if the man is not capable of divorcing her when that condition occurs. For example, let's say the man becomes insane and then the woman does that, whatever condition it was, the divorce still happens, even though the man is now in a state where he can't divorce her anymore, because it was never an illah with respect to him, it was only an illah with respect to her. Because in his example, again, Allah is above all examples, the man is like the divine lawgiver, he's made an instruction, that instruction is binding. It was not binding on him before he made it, and once he's made it, it's a real instruction. And the woman is like us, it's like people. Now the instruction has been made, the instruction came to us and we were capable to handle it. We're sane, we are capable, we understand, we're morally responsible. Then whenever the cause happens, we are obliged to follow it if we are capable at the time that the cause happens. So because we are the people, like the woman here, we have to be capable at the time of the cause. If we are, then it becomes obligatory for us. So anyways, that's his example to point out this theological point he really wants to underscore about the nature of the cause and therefore the nature of sacred law. as a result of God's obligation, and things don't obligate on God anything. So he says again, to summarize, and so the cause with respect to the divorce is originates in the word of the man, and so he just has to be capable of uttering it when he says it, not thereafter. And then finally, and this is the end, and then we'll just summarize. He says um, yeah, and then he wants to again continuing that theological point, the proof, if you like, for this theological point that he's making, is that these meanings existed before sacred law. Wheat was always there, and the various things the law talks about were always there, but they didn't bring about these injunctions. And if they did bring about these injunctions through themselves, they would never be separable. Uh, to return back to his example, it's like a woman doing the such and such that the man tied a divorce to before the man tied his divorce to it. So if the man says, if you go such and such a place, then you're divorced, a woman's going to that place before the man says any such thing has no consequence. Similarly, these illas, which the sacred law is tied to, have had no consequence before the sacred law. So he's showing for him it's a very clear example, the example of the divorce and the example of the illah that he's trying to explain. And this, of course, will happen throughout the book, which will be explaining the theory of law through the cases of law. And finally, this hal, which I said was the least emphasized in this presentation, this presumed ongoing state, is what is something which obligates an assumed continuation of a sacred ruling due to our ignorance of any alternative indicator, not because we know an indicator that makes things persist. Okay, if we want to summarize what he's been saying, just we can just reflect on it before we end here. I haven't got the best handwriting, unfortunately. So we have the hujja, which is a, if you like, a case against us in, I'm going to say here, in God's court. We will be overcome. We will never have any argument before Allah after these hujaj. And it's a case against us in the court of conscience, I'm going to call it here. Oops. Meaning, in this life, it's a case through which intellect overcomes lust, as long as the heart directs itself to them. So these are absolute cases, and it doesn't matter there. They work as cases in both realms, whether they lead to what is certain knowledge or whether they lead to what is probable knowledge. In each case, and he'll give the argument for this later, in each case, you are compelled to consider them. But the argument is obvious if you think about it, because most of the world of moral choices is probable. I think this is better to do, and we all understand what you think is better, you have to do something about it. You can't think something is better and then do something worse. That's not the way of the conscience or the way of the heart or the way of the spirit that he spoke about last time. So the proof is quite clear why probable indicators or probable proofs will also overcome you in both of these courts, the court of God's court and the court of conscience. And just to remind ourselves of the various terms he's used in this presentation, there was al-bayyina and there was also al-burhan, in case we come across these terms again later. And then we had 4 categories here. We had the al-ayah, which is clear sign. It's certain knowledge. But it needs a sort of, I'm going to call it heart direction, meaning it might need reflection. It might not be immediate, but that does not detract at all that it's a clear sign of certain knowledge. That's why he does not tie this to people of basira. There's no hint of a careful insight. Even when he gave the miracle of the Prophet ﷺ as an example, whose effect is no doubt greater than any miracle given to any prophet, that effect, which he's referring to earlier, is arrived at through reflection. But that reflection wasn't for people with specific forms of technical knowledge. It just needs reflection, careful consideration, careful comparison with other forms of speech and so on. And so he doesn't tie the ayah to people of careful consideration and insight or particular kinds of technical training. This is for everyone. And therefore, the greater subject matter of the book and of the subject is really the next two, the dalil and the illah. These are the things which he's used variably. He's used the term zu basira when he spoke about the dalil. And he used the term, he used the word ijtihad. He used the word istinbat. He used the word muqayasa. And so he's showing you that these two, the dalil and the illah, are really most of the hujaj that will require the kind of training that his book is presenting. The thing which needs real reflection, real insight. Very often what you get from them is probable and not certain, and therefore you need to be trained to arrive at the greatest probability possible, i.e. to really understand how to apply your penetrating insight with some talent and with some skill. And so therefore the dalil and the illah are the two main categories that require what you might call technical training. And then finally, the hal, which was the least presented here, and it's least presented, I think, throughout the book, but it's important to have in this schema, is just that we will not, when we strive to live, as he's told us last time, the moral life, the perfect life, a life of human perfection, when we strive to live such a life, our goal is not to find evidence for, or we can say you will not maybe find evidence for every particular. So what are you then supposed to do? What you're then supposed to do is just to understand general statements. What is normally the case? Again, the example I gave of water. Is it normally pure or impure? Or food? Is it normally halal or haram? Or money? Or gifts? And so there's an assumption of general states of things. And those general states will then be, again, obligating on us, again, in the court of God and in the court of conscience. And so they're important in the schema, but they're not important in the same way as the dalil and the illah in terms of a technical training. But they're important in the scheme of what are the cases that will be held against us. If you look at it, it is a rational scheme. It shows you different ways that we will arrive at knowledge of what God wants from us, and therefore, what is the way to learn from sacred law, the means to live the moral life and to strive towards human, and like I said last time, societal perfection. So that was our coverage then of this second chapter of this really remarkable book, as I think we're all beginning to see. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.